Welcome in, everybody, to this deep dive
Thanks for having me.
into the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021.
Absolutely.
This act,
Yeah.
it's not just a bunch of legal jargon.
Right.
It's a blueprint for like a major overhaul of policing in America
Yeah.
and a direct response to the outcry for justice and reform
Yeah.
after George Floyd's murder.
Absolutely.
We've got a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
Qualified immunity, body cameras, use of force, the whole 9 yards.
The whole thing, yeah.
So let's dive right in.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this act attempts to strike a balance.
Yeah.
It wants to hold law enforcement accountable for misconduct, absolutely.
Right.
But it also aims to promote transparency and build a system where trust can actually exist between the police and the communities they serve.
It's like trying to rebuild a house while people are still living in it.
Oh, totally.
Right. You have to address like the immediate problems.
Right.
While also laying the foundation for like
Yeah.
a stronger, more stable structure.
For sure.
So where do we even begin with this massive piece of legislation?
Well, one of the cornerstones is reforming qualified immunity.
Okay.
This legal doctrine has often shielded officers from lawsuits,
Right.
even in cases of clear misconduct.
Yeah.
The act wants to make it easier to hold officers accountable in court,
Okay.
to really ensure that the consequences of their actions match the severity of the offense.
So let's break that down.
Yeah,
We're talking about making it easier to sue officers in civil court, right?
exactly.
But how does the act actually propose to do that?
Right.
It's not like they're just waving a magic wand and saying, poof, no more qualified immunity.
You're exactly right. It's more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
The act narrows the scope of qualified immunity,
Okay.
making it harder for officers to claim they couldn't have known their actions were unlawful.
Got it.
It also clarifies the standard of proof required in these cases,
Okay.
shifting the burden more towards the officer to demonstrate that their actions were reasonable and justified.
So imagine a scenario where an officer uses excessive force during an arrest.
Right.
Under the current system,
Right.
they might be able to claim qualified immunity
Right.
because there's no clear precedent that specifically outlines the exact amount of force permissible
Right.
in that precise situation.
Yeah.
But this act aims to change that,
Exact.
to make it more difficult for officers to hide behind like vague legal interpretations.
Precisely. And it goes beyond individual officers.
Okay.
The act empowers the Attorney General to investigate entire law enforcement agencies for patterns of unconstitutional practices.
Wow.
This means they can step in if there's evidence of systemic issues,
Okay.
like excessive force or racial profiling within an entire department.
Now that's what I call holding the system accountable.
Right.
But investigations are only as good as the information they're based on.
Absolutely.
How does the act ensure that we have a clear picture of what's happening in police departments across the country?
That's where the National Police Misconduct Registry comes in. Think of it as a central database,
Okay.
a nationwide record that tracks complaints and disciplinary actions against officers.
So it's accessible to the public?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's about transparency,
Yeah.
allowing us to see the patterns, the repeat offenders, the departments with recurring problems.
Okay, so it's like a report card for police officers.
Yes.
But one that's accessible to the public.
Exactly.
Okay, so you can see who's been accused of misconduct, what the outcome of those investigations was, the whole shebang.
That's right.
That's a game changer in terms of accountability.
Absolutely. And it goes hand in hand with another crucial aspect of the Act data collection.
Okay.
Law enforcement agencies would be required to report detailed data on use of force incidents,
Okay.
broken down by race, ethnicity, gender, you name it.
So we're not just talking about raw numbers here.
Right.
We're talking about data that can reveal potential biases and disparities in how police interact with different communities.
Exactly.
This could be like a powerful tool for identifying areas that need serious reform.
Exactly. And speaking of targeting areas, the Act directly addresses racial profiling.
Okay.
It outlines a clear prohibition and establishes consequences for agencies and officers who engage in this practice.
You know, for something that's supposed to be illegal, racial profiling sure seems to happen a lot.
It does.
But how does the act propose to actually enforce this prohibition?
Right.
Is it just a matter of telling officers don't do this or else?
It's more than just words on paper.
Yeah.
The Act requires agencies to implement policies and training programs specifically aimed at preventing racial profiling.
Got it.
It also establishes a system for collecting data on traffic and pedestrian stops,
Okay.
focusing on areas with significant minority populations.
So they're not just saying don't be racist, they're trying to create mechanisms that actually address, like,
Exactly.
the systemic factors that contribute to racial bias in policing.
That's right.
And data collection is a key part of that,
Yes.
because you can't fix what you can't measure.
That's a great way to put it. And this focus on data and transparency extends to another key area, body cameras.
Ah, yes.
Yeah,
Those little cameras that have become almost ubiquitous
right.
in our digitally saturated world.
Yeah.
But in the context of law enforcement,
Mm.
they represent a potential tool for accountability, right?
Precisely.
Okay.
The Act sets requirements for federal law enforcement agencies to use body cameras, outlining when they must be activated
Okay.
and how the footage should be handled.
Got it.
It also encourages state and local agencies to adopt body camera programs by providing funding and establishing guidelines.
So it's like saying, look, we know these cameras aren't a perfect solution,
Right.
but they can provide valuable evidence in cases of misconduct.
Absolutely.
They can help protect both officers and citizens by creating like a more objective record
Yeah.
of what actually happened during an interaction.
Right.
But of course, there are always concerns about privacy
Of course.
and how this footage is used.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
You're right to raise those concerns.
Yeah.
The Act acknowledges those complexities and includes provisions for protecting privacy and ensuring that body camera footage is used appropriately.
Right.
It's about finding that balance between transparency and individual rights.
It's like walking a tightrope, isn't it?
It is.
They're trying to promote accountability without creating a surveillance state.
Exactly.
But let's move on to something a bit more well-intense.
Yeah.
Demilitarization of police forces.
This provision is a direct response to the growing concern that police departments are looking more and more like military units.
Yeah.
The Act restricts the transfer of certain military equipment to law enforcement agencies.
Sure.
We're talking about things like grenade launchers,
Oh, wow.
armored vehicles, weaponized drones,
Wow.
equipment that has no place in community policing.
I mean, you see images of police officers decked out in riot gear,
Right.
wielding military-grade weapons, and it's hard not to feel like they're preparing for war rather than protecting and serving their communities.
Exactly. The goal is to create a less intimidating and more approachable police presence.
Right.
It's about shifting the mindset from a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality,
Yeah.
emphasizing de-escalation and community engagement rather than force and intimidation.
It's about remembering that the police are supposed to be part of the community,
Yes.
not an occupying force.
Exactly.
But this act goes beyond just like the physical tools of policing.
Right.
It also tackles some deeply troubling issues, like the consent loophole.
This provision makes it a federal crime for law enforcement officers to engage in sexual acts with individuals under their custody,
Wow.
regardless of claimed consent.
It's hard to believe that this even needs to be spelled out in the law.
It is.
But sadly, the power dynamics in these situations are ripe for abuse.
They are.
This provision recognizes the inherent vulnerability of individuals in police custody
Right.
and makes it crystal clear that any sexual contact is a violation of the rights.
Absolutely. It's about protecting those who are most vulnerable to exploitation and abuse of power.
And it's a reminder that true justice requires us to confront, like, these uncomfortable truths
It does.
and hold those in positions of authority accountable for their actions.
Attacks.
But this act doesn't just focus on restrictions and prohibitions.
Right.
It also encourages community involvement in police reform.
This is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The Act supports the creation of civilian review boards and local task forces focused on public safety innovation.
So it's not just about top-down reform.
Right.
It's about empowering communities to have a say in how they're policed.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing that true public safety requires collaboration and trust
Absolutely.
between law enforcement and the people they serve.
That's the key takeaway here. It's about shifting the paradigm from solely top-down enforcement to a more collaborative model.
Right.
And it's about recognizing that police reform isn't just about changing laws. It's about changing the culture of policing and building relationships.
Right.
But, as we dive deeper into this act, it raises a crucial question for you, our listener.
Yeah. What aspects of this resonate most with you?
Exactly.
It's a lot to digest, we know.
It is.
But as you listen to this deep dive, think about the implications for your own community.
Yeah,
Do you see this act as a step in the right direction?
right.
How might these changes affect the balance between safety and justice
Right.
in your own neighborhood?
These are important questions to ponder.
Yeah.
And remember, we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore within this groundbreaking legislation.
For sure.
Let's shift gears a bit and look at how the Act tries to change the way police officers actually operate on the ground.
Okay.
For example,
Yeah.
it tackles the use of chokeholds and carotid holds head on.
You're talking about the Eric Garner Excessive Use of Force Prevention Act, right?
Exactly.
That's a powerful statement.
It is.
Naming a section of the bill after someone whose death sparked national outrage and demands for change.
Exactly. This provision would make it a federal crime for law enforcement officers to use chokeholds or carotid holds, techniques that restrict blood flow or oxygen to the brain.
Right.
These are incredibly dangerous techniques.
Yeah.
And their use has led to far too many tragic and preventable deaths.
So if this act becomes law, what does that mean for officers on the ground?
Yeah.
How will it actually change their behavior?
It means a fundamental shift in their training
Okay.
and the way they approach situations.
Okay.
The Act emphasizes de-escalation tactics
Right.
and the use of force only as a last resort.
Okay.
It requires officers to give verbal warnings,
Right.
try to de-escalate the situation,
Mm.
and request a person's surrender
Okay.
before resorting to force.
Okay. I can see how that's a major change in philosophy.
Yeah,
But what about those situations where an officer feels they have no other choice but to use force?
right.
How does the act address that?
The Act tackles that too.
Okay.
It limits the justification defense for officers in cases where their use of force was inconsistent with these guidelines, or if their gross negligence contributed to the necessity of using force.
Right.
Basically, it holds officers to a higher standard of accountability,
Okay.
even in challenging situations.
So it's like saying, look, we understand that you have a tough job,
Right.
but you can't just use force whenever you feel like it.
Yeah.
You have to follow these guidelines, and if you don't, you'll be held accountable.
Right.
It creates a clear framework for what's acceptable and what's not.
Exactly. It's about establishing clear expectations and consequences for officers who violate those expectations.
Right.
And of course, let's not forget about data collection. It's not just about changing practices. It's about measuring the impact of those changes.
Right.
And ensuring that these reforms are actually working.
Data is key.
Yes.
You can't just make changes and hope for the best.
Exactly.
You have to track the data, analyze it,
Right.
and see if those changes are actually leading to reduction in use of force incidents, complaints against officers, and all those other metrics we talked about earlier.
Right. And if the data shows that certain reforms aren't working as intended,
Yeah,
then we need to be willing to adapt, refine, and continue to push for progress.
for sure.
Speaking of pushing for progress, let's talk about another hot-button issue.
Okay.
The transfer of military equipment to local police departments.
Right.
It often feels like we're seeing a militarization of police forces,
Yeah.
especially in response to protests or civil unrest.
It's like something out of a dystopian novel.
It is.
Seeing police officers rolling through neighborhoods in armored vehicles armed with military-grade weapons,
It's intimidating.
it creates a sense of fear and intimidation
Yeah.
that just escalates tensions.
The Act directly addresses that concern.
Okay.
It restricts the transfer of certain military equipment to law enforcement agencies.
So like what specifically?
We're talking grenade launchers,
Okay.
bayonets,
Okay.
tracked armored vehicles, weaponized drones, firearms, and ammunition of .50 caliber or greater.
Wow.
Equipment that's designed for warfare, not community policing.
So they're trying to draw a clear line between the military and the police,
Yes.
recognizing that their roles and responsibilities are fundamentally different.
Exactly.
But how do they enforce this?
Right.
What's stopping a police department from just saying, oh, we really need this tank to keep our community safe?
That's where funding comes into play.
Okay.
The Act links compliance with these provisions to the receipt of federal grants.
Okay.
So if a state or local agency wants to continue receiving federal funding for law enforcement,
Yeah.
they have to demonstrate that they're implementing the Act's reforms,
Okay.
including this restriction on military equipment.
It's like saying, look, we're serious about this.
Yeah.
If you want our money, you have to play by our rules.
Right.
That's a pretty powerful incentive,
It is.
especially for departments that rely heavily on federal funding.
It's a significant lever for change.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond direct financial consequences. The Act also authorizes the Attorney General to bring civil action against law enforcement agencies that engage in a pattern or practice of unconstitutional misconduct.
Okay, so there are legal tools at their disposal as well.
Exactly.
So we've got financial incentives,
Yeah.
legal consequences, and That system of data collection and pattern and practice investigations we discussed earlier,
Yes.
it sounds like they've really tried to build a comprehensive system of accountability.
They've definitely taken a multi-layered approach,
Yeah,
recognizing that real change requires a combination of carrots and sticks.
right.
But, we've talked a lot about holding police accountable, changing their practices,
Right.
and restricting certain tools.
Right.
But what about the officers themselves?
Right.
How does this act address their needs and concerns?
That's an important point.
Yeah,
After all, police officers are human beings too.
they are.
And they're often operating under incredibly stressful and dangerous conditions.
Absolutely.
So it can't just be about punishment and restrictions.
Right.
It has to be about providing support and resources as well.
You're absolutely right. The Act doesn't solely focus on restrictions and punishments.
Okay.
It also recognizes the need for support and training for law enforcement officers.
Okay.
There are provisions for mental health resources, for training on de-escalation tactics and implicit bias,
Right.
and for community policing programs that can help foster better relationships between officers and the communities they serve.
So it's about empowering officers to do their jobs better,
Yes,
to approach situations with less reliance on force
exactly.
and more emphasis on communication, empathy, and understanding.
Right.
It's about investing in the human side of policing.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that police officers are not robots.
Yeah.
They're people who are often dealing with trauma stress and the complexities of human behavior.
Right.
By providing them with the tools and support they need, we can create a more humane and effective system of law enforcement.
So we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act.
We have.
From qualified immunity to demilitarization to community engagement.
Yeah.
It's clear that this legislation aims for, systemic change,
It does.
a reimagining of what policing in America could look like.
Right.
But let's be realistic for a moment.
Okay.
What are the potential challenges
Sure.
of implementing such sweeping reforms?
Yeah.
It's not like flipping a switch
Right.
and suddenly everything's different.
You're right. It's going to be a long and complex process.
Yeah.
One major hurdle is getting buy-in from law enforcement agencies across the country.
Okay.
There's bound to be resistance to some of these provisions,
Right.
especially from those who feel their current practices are sufficient
Right.
or view these reforms as an attack on law enforcement.
Yeah, I can see how change can be threatening,
It can.
especially when it comes to something as deeply ingrained as the culture of policing. And let's not forget the political climate surrounding this issue.
Right.
Police reform has become such a polarizing topic,
It has.
and that can make it even harder to find common ground
It does.
and implement meaningful change.
Absolutely. The act has been met with mixed reactions.
Yeah.
Some praising it as a necessary step towards accountability,
Right,
and others criticizing it as overly broad or burdensome.
right.
Navigating these differing viewpoints and finding common ground will be essential
Yeah,
for successful implementation.
absolutely.
It's not about demonizing one side or the other. It's about recognizing that everyone has a stake in creating a system of policing that is just equitable and effective.
And even if we somehow manage to overcome the political hurdles
Right.
and get everyone on board with the idea of reform,
Yeah.
there's still the practical challenge of putting these changes into practice.
Yeah.
It's going to require resources, training, and a significant cultural shift within law enforcement agencies.
Absolutely.
That's not something that happens overnight.
You're absolutely right. Implementing this act will require a sustained commitment from both the federal government and individual states.
Right.
It means providing adequate funding for training, technology upgrades, and data collection systems.
Right.
It also means ongoing monitoring and evaluation to ensure that the reforms are being implemented effectively and having the intended impact.
It's like planting a seed.
Yeah.
You can't just stick it in the ground and expect it to flourish on its own.
Right.
You have to nurture it, provide the right conditions, and be patient as it grows and evolves.
That's a great analogy.
But there's another piece of this puzzle that we haven't fully explored yet. Yeah. The role of the community.
Yes,
The Act emphasizes community involvement in police reform.
it does.
But how do we actually make that happen?
Right.
It sounds great in theory,
It does.
but what does it look like in practice?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It requires building bridges and fostering dialogue between law enforcement and the communities they serve.
Yeah.
It means creating spaces where people feel safe to share their concerns,
Right.
provide input, and hold police accountable.
Right.
It also means supporting community-based organizations that are already doing this work on the ground.
So it's not just about changing laws.
It's
about changing relationships.
It is.
It's about recognizing that true public safety requires a collaborative effort
It does.
between law enforcement and the communities they are sworn to protect.
Right.
It's about building trust, understanding, and mutual respect.
It
It's
is.
about recognizing that we're all in this together.
Beautifully put.
Mm-hmm.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, from qualified immunity to body cameras to demilitarization.
We have.
But as we've discussed, this is just the beginning.
The Act is a significant step towards addressing systemic issues in law enforcement.
It is.
But its success hinges on sustained commitment, collaboration, and a willingness to embrace change.
It does.
It's not a magic bullet.
Right.
But it's a powerful tool for creating a more just and equitable system of policing.
And as always, we leave you, our listener, with something to ponder.
Yes.
As we strive for a more just and equitable system of policing, what role can you play in promoting accountability, transparency, and community engagement in your own community?
Right.
How can we collectively work to ensure that the tragic events that inspired this act serve as a catalyst for meaningful and lasting change?
These are questions worth contemplating as we continue the journey towards a more just and equitable society for all. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.